What's going on, everybody? Kalibis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Cricket Debut Smart and the Motorola Moto G Pure. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about each of them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Cricket Debut Smart, we're getting a 5.5-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 295, and an 18:9 aspect ratio. With the Moto G Pure, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So in general, in pretty much every way, the Moto G Pure does have a much better display. On one hand, both phones do have 720p resolutions, but I do feel like the colors and brightness with the Moto G Pure look a little bit better. And in addition to this, of course, as you can clearly see, the Moto G Pure at 6.5 inches versus 5.5 inches with the Cricket Debut Smart is much larger. With the 20:9 aspect ratio versus 18:9, the Moto G Pure also has a much taller and more narrow form factor. So honestly, in general, if you're going to be consistently doing any kind of content consumption, I would definitely recommend the Moto G Pure over the Cricket Debut Smart. Because with the Cricket Debut Smart, although some people might like this display size, just because the phone itself is really compact, in general, if you're really going to be consuming a lot of content, having a larger display with a taller, more narrow form factor is going to give you a much better experience overall. Now for storage, both phones are getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion. So honestly, this is really not great. And unless you're really just doing the bare minimum on your phone, you're probably going to want more than this. In this day and age, even with really low-end phones, I feel like every phone nowadays should have 64 gigabytes at least, because with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger, 32 gigabytes, while maybe being acceptable like 10 years ago, is really just not enough space for most people in this day and age. That being said though, again, if you're really just doing the bare minimum, if you have maybe like a few social media apps and nothing else, then especially with the micro SD card expansion, you might at least get by. Now for security features, both phones do have face unlock, but with the Moto G Pure, we're also getting a fingerprint scanner right here on the back, whereas unfortunately, the Cricket Debut does not have a fingerprint scanner. But let's go ahead and give this a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, it's real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, both phones do have face unlock. So while again, unfortunately, the Cricket Debut Smart does not have a fingerprint scanner, at least we do get one other option besides a pin to unlock it. Now taking a look at the cameras here, with the Cricket Debut Smart, we got a 5 megapixel front facing camera. Then on the back, we got a single 5 megapixel rear camera. So when it comes to features, there's really not a whole lot here. And with the Moto G Pure, honestly, it's not really a whole lot better. We got a 5 megapixel front facing camera here as well. And then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So unfortunately, neither phone has either an ultra wide camera or a macro camera. But honestly, especially with the Cricket Debut, that's not really surprising. I mean, I got this phone for like $20, so what can you really expect? That being said, if you want a usable camera at least, then I would definitely go with the Moto G Pure, because while the photos on this phone aren't really great, you can at least get some nice photos and portrait mode works decently well. Whereas with the Cricket Debut Smart, everything is just going to look grainy and dull, and really the camera on this phone is not good. That being said, if you're just using something like Snapchat, or maybe just scanning barcodes or something like that, the Cricket Debut will at least get the job done. But again, if you want to take usable photos, you are going to want to go with the Moto G Pure. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the Cricket Debut Smart, we're getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. With the Moto G Pure, we're getting 3 gigabytes of RAM as well with the MediaTek Helio G25. So when it comes to overall performance, keep in mind, neither phone is very fast at all. And honestly, you're really not going to see a huge performance difference between the two. But that being said, it's really to be expected, because when it comes to entry-level phones, these phones are pretty much the bottom, most affordable tier, and phones like this are really not meant to be fast. That being said though, if you're doing really just the bare minimum here, maybe some occasional web browsing, social media, and streaming content like videos and music, but aside from that, you're really just not using your phone a whole lot, in that kind of situation, either of these phones will be perfectly fine. But if you're doing really anything else, you're definitely going to want to spend a little bit more and get something slightly higher end with a better processor. That being said, of course, I did run benchmark tests on these phones using Geekbench 5, and here are the scores I got. So as you can see here, again, they are pretty close. The Cricket Debut Smart technically did score a little bit higher, but honestly, in my experience, you're really not going to see a significant performance difference between the two. I seriously doubt either of these phones are going to be an upgrade from your current device, unless you have a really old low-end phone or something like that. But in general, just keep in mind, again, these phones are really just not meant to be fast. And if you're going to be on your phone a decent amount, then you're probably going to want to get something else. But again, if you are really a light user and you're just not doing a whole lot on your phone in general, then either of these phones will at least get the job done. Now for the batteries, there is a bit of a difference here. With the Cricket Debut Smart, we're getting a 2500 mAh battery, and the Moto G Pure has a 4000 mAh battery. So in general, between the two, the battery life and longevity with the Moto G Pure is going to be much better. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're not always around a charger, and you want to make sure you have a phone that's going to last all day, the Moto G Pure is going to be a pretty good option, whereas with the Cricket Debut Smart, this is probably not going to be a great choice. Another thing I do want to point out though, is that the Cricket Debut Smart actually has a removable battery, and in case you're wondering, to take it out, there's a little tab right here. You don't want to pull this. The back is going to come right off. And as you can see, the battery is right here, and from this area, you can also access the SIM card and the microSD card. So in this day and age, having a removable battery is definitely a more unique feature that you only really see in super low-end phones. But one potential advantage here is that with a removable battery, if you are in a situation where you know you're not going to be around a charger and you need extra battery life, I guess you could technically just get a few more batteries, and when one dies, you can just switch it out. Now, in my opinion, that's a lot more trouble than it's actually worth, but it's still an option all the same. But in general, aside from that, between the two, if you want the best battery, the Moto G Pure with a 4000 mAh battery versus again only 2500 is definitely going to be a much better choice. Another thing to keep in mind here is that with the Cricket Debut Smart, we are getting Android 12, whereas the Moto G Pure only has Android 11. Now, seeing that these are such low-end phones, I don't expect either of them to get any major updates, and because of this, if you want the latest version of Android, obviously in that case, neither of these phones is going to be a great option, but if you want something at least decently newer, then the Cricket Debut Smart will have an advantage, because at least again this phone does have Android 12, whereas again the Moto G Pure only has Android 11, and I don't imagine it's actually going to get an update to Android 12. In addition to this, neither phone has NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, you won't be able to do that with either phone. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, in most ways, I feel like these phones are pretty much interchangeable. They're both super low end, really featureless, and have relatively slow performance. But that being said, I feel like if you're a really light user and you just need a phone for the bare minimum for occasional basic activities, and you actually want to get a phone to keep for the long term, then in that case I would go with the Moto G Pure, because this phone has a significantly better display that's quite a bit larger, has a camera that can take at least usable photos, and it has a much larger battery. So in general, if you're getting a phone you actually want to keep, the Moto G Pure is definitely going to be a much better option. But on the other hand, if you're getting maybe a temporary phone, for example, maybe you just need a really inexpensive backup phone, keep in mind, while both of these phones are really cheap, the Cricket Debut Smart is almost for sure going to be cheaper than the Moto G Pure. So in that kind of situation, if again you just need a phone for the absolute bare minimum, but you're also not really going to be using it very often, and maybe you're not even planning on keeping it for very long, in that kind of situation, the Cricket Debut Smart is still going to be perfectly fine. But this concludes my comparison between the Cricket Debut Smart and the Motorola Moto G Pure. Again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.